Hi, yeah, look how dark this is. Damn, I should have, oh, we could use my phone for some light.
Or a lamp.
Yeah, but I don't know where a lamp is and I don't want to try to find one, you know? Yeah, where do you put this? So, God, I wish I'd thought about my ring light. That was stupid. You know what, can you turn those lights off, that bank of lights? Off?
The
Yeah, the
one
ones
that,
behind me. It might be over, yeah, try the sliders for that. It's all of them are going off. See? Put them back on, all of them back on. I want to see if we can do a bank at a time.
okay, you can see those ones?
What? Oh yeah, turn those off. That helps. And then, is there a way to turn this row off? No, it's all of them. What's the middle one? No, turn, oh, it's that way. No, you better turn these up back on. We don't have any light. I'm so upset I didn't think to bring my ring light. That was stupid. Let's plug this in. That was stupid. Hi, which was great. So I'm Erica Rosenberg. It's great to see you here. I'm for years off and on been an instructor at Enigma Institute, and I just have to say this is my first time back here in person since COVID, and I've done some online Dharma talks, but I haven't been in person in the Institute in at least 4 years, probably five, given that it's 2024. But so I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm also really happy to connect with all of you. Thank you for coming. It means a lot, and especially here in Berkeley, it's a gorgeous day, so I could see why it would be hard to go inside and do something like this. But welcome. And also, I need a little disclaimer or caveat, whatever you want to call it. I do a lot of online teaching and I also do a lot of in-person teaching, but this is what we call a hybrid. And so I'm going to do my best to manage, the back and forth. I don't want to just look at the screen since I have people in the room. So I might be sitting back here and talking, and because I have in person and we don't have projections set up, that's another good thing about having that set up if I have a slide to share. I might write on the whiteboard, and if so, I'll try to do this so that you can see what I'm doing. But I kind of decided that I would do this in the tradition of a more traditional Dharma talk, and since I was coming in person and not have a lot of things to put up, but inevitably there's something I'll be explaining and I might want to write. So without further ado, I'll start. And the topic of my talk today is, I'll read the title, On the Immeasurable Benefits of Compassion, Why Growing Your Compassionate Nature Can Help with Everything. And that really captures a lot. First of all, the boundless nature of compassion and the fact that it is so beneficial in so many ways, in far-reaching ways. And if you don't already believe that, I'm hoping that I can convince you of that. And also, I will talk a little bit about how you grow it. And the word growing really implies that there's something in us that's already that way and that we can kind of make it bigger. And so that makes it easier. We're not trying to manufacture something that's not inside us. This is something we have, and we can learn to see it in ourselves and grow it. But mainly I want to kind of make an argument about why compassion is so great. In fact, when months ago, when Olivia was looking for topics for Dharma Talks, I think I sent you like a one-line email. It says, why compassion helps with everything. And then you went back, you developed that a little bit. But, and I thought, and I appreciated needing to develop it a little bit, but also that was sort of, it came right from the heart, and it comes from this place of, I feel fortunate that actually because of since for the past 30 some odd years, studying in the Nyingma tradition and doing the meditations and studying psychology and all these different things, just learning really what a difference it makes in experience to connect to others, to see what you share and with them, to feel moved by the conditions that they go through and see it in yourself. And because of that similarity, getting it and noticing that suffering is everywhere, and so is joy, and so are all kinds of variations in between, that the more you're present with that, the more you live with that, the stronger you become. And you just have this like ability to accommodate more. I sort of feel like it's funny, I wasn't thinking about this literally. We talk about growing our compassionate nature, but in a way, I think it just makes you feel bigger, bigger in the sense of able to accommodate more. So that's sort of my thesis or the point I'm trying to make. And you might already be sold on that idea. And if you are, that's awesome. I hope you are. And, but I'm going to come at this, there's three things I'm going to do. And I'm going to come at these three different topics really, or aspects of compassion from three different perspectives. So the three things I'm going to try to do is talk about what compassion is, and talk about how the second is talk about why it's beneficial to things, feelings, states, actions, all kinds of things. And then lastly, address this issue of how do you grow it? How can we work on building our compassionate nature? So that's the roadmap of what I hope to accomplish. And the ways in which I want to accomplish that, I realize there's another three things. Part of it's going to, come first from Buddhism, Nyingma psychology, the perspective of meditative practice. That's going to be one of the orientations on compassion and these questions. Another one will be what I call the psychological scientific. This is professionally, I'm a scientific psychologist. I study human behavior and emotion, and I also study compassion and meditation. So a lot of what I talk about might come in. I'll be talking about some of those things too, and what we know in some cases from psychology and science about the topic of compassion and how it affects our lives. And then the last perspective will be experiential, just really as a human being and practitioner, what I can say and what I've actually heard from my students in their journeys of growing compassion. So that's what I'm going to do. And also I should say it's because I'm at one more logistical thing. I'm not going to be able to watch comments in the comment field much, except for maybe when I specifically ask for questions. So if you have a clarification question, if there's something you don't understand, raise your hand, or maybe Harry, and you can shout out, there's a question, whatever. But generally what I'll do is just try to talk this through and not have too much discussion and leave time at the end for discussion, because it might be hard to manage it all. All right? Okay, so what's compassion? I think we all have an intuitive sense of what compassion means. And even the word, if you take the English word that draws from the Latin, there's the feeling with element, passion with somebody. I'm not going to get into a long discussion of the word and what it means yet. I'll get into that a little bit more when I start bringing in kind of more a formal psychological perspective on it. But I want to start with Buddhism here. And, being in the Institute here also makes it just feel like the thing to do. And for me, I think it's the place to start. And many of you know that compassion is one of the Brahma Viharas, which is one of those four immeasurable qualities of mind and heart that we can cultivate to bring balance to our thoughts, to our feelings, to our actions. And there's something in that actually recognizes that we are facing, what we face in life is a whole slew of things. And there's a lot of suffering and there's a lot of joy, and it's hard to venture through it. And one of the things I've always loved about the Brahma Viharas, which are also called the four immeasurables, and I'll probably refer to them that way, is when I first encountered them as a young student, I was so impressed by the idea that, these are qualities of mind and heart that you can develop to counteract destructive qualities. And that and to me, it was always like they're like magic potions that you could apply selectively to improve your quality of life, how your presence, your ability to interact with others. So compassion is one of these, and many of you here, I'm sure, already know what they are, but just for the sake of being thorough, the four measurables or the four Brahma Viharas, we start, I'll give the English terms: loving kindness, compassion, what I'm going to call empathetic joy, sometimes it's called sympathetic joy, and then equanimity. And each one of those has this ability to counteract something destructive. So loving kindness is sort of that thing that will put out anger. It's hard to, if you're really feeling love for somebody and you've cultivated that, and or somebody or something, and it's welling up inside, it's hard to sustain anger. Or if you got the flame of anger and you throw some love at it, it'll put the fire out. It's just really magical that way. So that's loving kindness is an antidote to anger. And then compassion, which one way to think about what compassion is, I'll actually give a kind of a colloquial, easy, experiential way of talking about it. One of my colleagues said this once, and it's just so simple. It's meeting suffering with kindness. Or you could have broadened it to say meeting suffering with love. And part of that kindness and love is acknowledging it, acknowledging how it hits, and feeling the pain of it, because I know what it's like to feel it just like you do. And it's a really deep thing. So it's got the love part of it, but it's also got this acknowledgement of what's going on. In fact, Alan Wallace, who's written a lot about the four measurables, in one of his books, The Boundless Heart, he talks about the difference between loving kindness and compassion. And he said, loving kindness is like a vision. May you be happy, may you be fulfilled, may you flourish. I want all these good things for you. That loving kindness has that kind of really optimistic, blooming, blossoming element to it. Whereas compassion, he said, loving kindness sees, compassion witnesses. It witnesses that the individual in all the glory and or suffering that life might present. And so it has this kind of breadth of perspective for the difficult. When you talk about antidotes, I said loving kindness is an antidote for anger. Compassion is an antidote for cruelty. It's also, you see this in some writings, and I really like this, so you don't see it everywhere, but it's also an antidote to indifference or apathy and not caring, So it works against being cruel, and also works against not being touched by the condition of things. And then, just to be complete, empathetic joy, which is feeling joy in someone else's good fortune. Rather, it's an antidote to things like jealousy and envy, which makes sense. If you really realize, wow, we can all be happy, this is great. There's not only a limited amount of joy that can go around. If you get some, that doesn't mean I won't. So we could, like compassion, it has a lot of this, removing some of those boundaries between people. And then equanimity, which is a sense of, really grounded balance and not being swayed. Not showing bias in one direction or another, being equally open. Actually, sometimes equanimity, when we talk about equanimity, we talk about not being this and not being that, but you could also think of it in a positive sense of being open to all. And I like to look at equanimity that way. That, of course, is an antidote to things like prejudice and bias. So that's about all I'm going to say about all of the four measurables, and I'm going to focus on compassion. So when I talk about and again, from the Buddhist perspective, if I'm talking about what this quality, in this case compassion, is an antidote to, that thing that it works against is what we call a far enemy. Many of you are familiar with this notion of there being near enemies and far enemies. So far enemies are states or qualities that are really different, or like the opposite. So a far enemy of compassion is cruelty. There's also near enemies, things that are close but no cigar, right? Things that look like it, but there's something fundamentally missing. And when it comes to compassion, one of the common near enemies is pity. And you're feeling pity for somebody, you're looking down. There's a sort of like, oh, I feel too bad that you're going through that, but there's something, it's almost more of a cognitive perspective that's unfortunate, but it's not connecting. It doesn't have that common humanity element of we're all in this together and we all suffer like that. Another near enemy of compassion can be grief, of the endless, of being so caught in the suffering that it's difficult to see. And we can talk more about each of those states if people are interested, but I want to go on to talking a little bit more about compassion. So compassion is, witnessing suffering. I'm going to move now into a little bit more of a psychological definition of it because it helps unpack what compassion is a little bit more methodically, not methodologically, methodically. But I know that I'm not talking about suffering a lot, and that's one thing that comes up when we start talking about compassion is the importance of saying what is suffering, which is like a whole really long conversation or a thesis, but just to be fair or to acknowledge that when we talk about suffering is everything from the things that happen in the world, but even more importantly, our response to them, and especially this inability we have at times to let go of things and to cling on to things. And that a lot of the suffering is not so much just in what emerges like a disaster or an illness or what have you, but it's in how we relate to that event in the world. And that, because of that, that gives us the opportunity for freedom, right? Because if there's a lot of suffering in how we evaluate things in the world, and whether we see something as a threat when it might not be, some things are real threats, and we need to know that, right? But not, we can get kind of threat sensitive from life experience or our genetic destiny or what have you, right? And if we can learn to see that, oh, I'm very threat sensitive, I have a tendency to evaluate things in a way that means they're going to harm me. Maybe there's a real harm there, maybe there isn't. And if you can learn that about yourself through mindfulness and self-compassion, you can learn to let go of that kind of suffering a little bit more. And that's actually what I just talked about. That's all self-compassion. That's all self-compassion. That's recognizing a pattern of suffering in the self and noticing what you can do about it and learning to soften. But at any rate, just wanted to acknowledge that about suffering. And I want to share a quote from Rinpoche, Tartang Tolku Rinpoche, from my favorite book. I didn't bring it, I wrote the quote down. Of all Rinpoche's books, my favorite is probably Openness Mind, which is a little tiny volume of teachings from like the 80s, early 80s. And there's great chapters in there on emotion and stuff. But in the very beginning, there's a little comment on practice and suffering. And I love this. It's a quote from page 10 for those of you who have the book from Rinpoche. The teachings advise us to understand our suffering deeply so that we will not need it anymore. Is that a good one? I'll say it again. The teachings advise us to understand our suffering deeply so that we will not need it anymore. And it's a comment on how, the not be present with it. We need to be present with it, not just in others, but in ourselves. We need to see it. We need to see what the patterns of behavior or thinking are that set it up. And meditation is really helpful for that because it takes those perspectives or those thought patterns that we don't necessarily know about ourselves. But when you're sitting there with nothing but you in your mind, you start seeing them. Oh, I do this with my mind and I do that with my mind. And you can learn to bring in a little bit more choice about who. I'll start giving my meditation teaching metaphors now. Who's got the microphone? Which voice is going to be shouting out in your mind? And you can start making choices. And with enough self-compassion, you can make ones that are kind for yourself. So anyway, we got to understand our suffering. I would like to turn now to a little bit more psychological, scientific way of talking about what compassion is. It's not really scientific, but it's one that's it's just more psychological than anything, but it's been used in some scientific research. And this is, we can put in words, like this is what I might put in a textbook, and I think I did, that compassion is a response to suffering in ourselves or others, basically in anyone, and being moved by it, caring, and wanting to help relieve the suffering. So there's all these elements to it. So it's, a response to suffering in yourself or others, feeling moved by it, and wanting to do something about it, wanting to be. And so there's an attentional component, what we call the noticing. You have to attend to what's going on. You have to notice that suffering is there, and this is why when you think about how do you grow your compassion, why we need to have cultivated a sense of mindful awareness of our thoughts, of our actions, of all these things, to be able to notice how we are feeling and to notice the world around us, notice suffering, and to feel hit by it. I think that's, like any concept, there are a lot of definitions of compassion, but I think it's really important. This particular definition is informed by experience, that if and a particular perspective on teaching and practicing, that it's important to feel moved by the suffering of others, and that emotional response, the way it hits you to feel moved by the suffering, is part of what helps motivate us to get rid of it, because we have this empathic resonance. We know it doesn't feel good to suffer, and we want, oh, I see that, and I know I might not have gone through exactly what that person's going through, but I know what it feels like to suffer, or to be angry, or to be sad, and that can help eliminate it. So it's got a noticing element, it's got a feeling with, and then the caring, element that you want to see it relieve. Part of that's motivated by empathy, and part of that is motivated by understanding how you share so much with everybody else, even though they might have very different backgrounds, education, come from different parts of the world, different beliefs. Underneath it all, there's something really similar. We're all just trying to get through this thing called life with not too much discomfort, maybe some joy, be safe, those kinds of things. So the motivation to do something, part of that comes from embracing what we call what's shared among us or common among us. And then this is interesting, and I've even been present in arguments with His Holiness the Dalai Lama about this topic of whether compassion has to have the acting part, whether you have to carry it through to doing something. And I think, there's general consensus, there has to be at least the wish or the urge to help, and maybe you could say the most fully compassionate responses go all the way, that maybe you can be very, very compassionate, just feeling moved and wanting to help. But if you really go all the way, then that's super compassionate. But I'd like to remind all of us, sometimes you can't do anything to change the situation somebody's in, like if you're present with someone else who's suffering. But to remind people that and remind myself and everybody that a very powerful behavioral choice, a powerful way you can act with someone who's suffering, is to be with them. You don't have to know how to fix the predicament that they're in, but you can be present and you can listen, and that's an action because it's a behavioral choice. So that's my little public service announcement in the middle of the whole talk. But okay. So that's a little breaking down of what compassion is psychologically. And one of the interesting things about psychological perspectives on compassion is that you get into this discussion of what I might call risk areas when you're working with compassion or talking about compassionate states. And when I say risk areas, you've probably heard the term compassion burnout or compassion fatigue. And what are those things? And those are things you hear reported or real phenomena, by the way, that you hear reported by people who are like in social work is one of the professions with a high degree of burnout, and a lot of people call it compassion burnout. The question is compassion burnout the same as burnout? I got a burnout expert in my crowd here, Mary, so you could correct me if I'm just going to use it very generally. But one of the things that can happen when you're working with compassion or trying to be more compassionate or connecting to suffering with others is there's a risk to get sucked in to what we might call your own personal distress at their suffering. Okay, so your emotional reaction can be overwhelming. Or, so sometimes people talk about personal distress, or they talk about what's called empathic distress. They're not the same thing. Empathic distress, I mean, they overlap, but empathic distress is really like you're sharing feeling, you're connecting so much to what somebody else is going through that it overwhelms you emotionally. And that tied up with that, and somewhat separate too, can be just you have a huge emotional reaction to the fact that they're suffering so much. And that kind of thing can be physically and psychologically exhausting. I was thinking about it, that you could call it compassion fatigue, but one way to a term, and Mary, I don't know if anybody's used this, but I think that you could call it suffering fatigue. You know, it's just like an overwhelm with all the suffering, yours and theirs, and your reaction to them, that's what wears people out. And there is, I know the empathy research, like going back to Nancy Eisenberger's stuff, they talk about this empathic distress and personal distress can kind of masquerade as compassion or empathy, but it's not. And it kind of reminds me, it's kind of like a near enemy. Is there anything, I'm looking at my friend, at my lifelong spiritual friend, fellow Nyingma instructor, student, and just all around amazing person, Mary Gomes, who's in the crowd, and she's done work on burnout, the crowd, my crowd of three. Is there anything on that maybe I'm missing or to add, or?
Not that I can think of. I know that when I'm teaching that the distinction between empathic distress and compassion really hits the target for the students.
Oh, okay.
Everyone has experienced
I'll repeat what she said.
distress.
Yeah, yeah. And in case you didn't hear Mary, because I know she's not mic'd, for those of you online, she said when she's teaching her college students, and she makes this distinction between empathic distress and compassion, they get it, you know, and or personal distress too. Do you use that term? No, you don't.
Actually, I'm hearing it for the first time.
Oh, right.
We're going to talk about that.
Well, what's interesting is, at least in psychology, I often hear people using those synonymously, and they're kind of, but not, yeah. So anyway, what we're getting at here, and I don't want to get too esoteric on the academic stuff, but that when you're you're doing practices where you connect to suffering another. When I use the word cultivating, it means you're working on compassion, you're trying to grow it in some way. Empathy is actually part of the process because it's important to be moved by what you see and to connect to the feeling of another. And one of the things that can conjure the compassionate response is like that cognitive perspective taking that we do with empathy, imagining ourselves in someone else's shoes or what the situation they're going through. So it is easy to get sucked into it, getting overwhelmed by feeling. And one of the things that really helps with that, and I'll talk more about this at the last part of the talk, is if you've really shored up your skills of self-compassion. And if you have good skills of self-compassion and noticing when you're not doing well and being able to tend to your own condition, then you can see when you're pushing yourself too far, you know, and that helps. And there are certain professions definitely that tax people so much that it's easy to fall into that. Okay, so I wanted to talk about the risks of compassion and are things that can be kind of experiential near enemies. You can get sucked in to being overwhelmed by someone's suffering and how it makes you feel. And it can make it impossible. It's a barrier. It's actually a barrier to compassion because you go into overload and you can't do it. All right, so I think one other thing I want to say about what compassion is I haven't talked a lot about how compassion feels. I've talked about how compassion feels or how it feels when it goes awry and you don't quite get there. But what I haven't talked about is how it feels when you're in it when you're being compassionate and there's an instance of great compassion for somebody. And there's this phrase that's used a lot that's called the warm glow. There's this feeling of being, it is almost, and the warm glow is both metaphoric and there's a little bit that's literal to it. There's actually kind of a slight elevation in skin temperature and just feeling great when you've done something nice for somebody or you've helped somebody out and you've connected to it. So there's that feeling. That's one feeling that's been associated with being compassionate, and that rings true experientially. Anybody ever have that feeling of that kind of warm glow that comes from helping somebody and doing, being present when someone's hurting? And I'm seeing some nodding, and there's certainly some in the room. Another one is this feeling of connectedness. Connectedness is something that fuels compassion. I mentioned embracing common humanity. So when we embrace what's shared among us, we feel connected. And when we feel connected, we're more likely to help. That helps. But there's also this vibe, this experiential quality of feeling connected. That's really amazing. And I think it's amazing because that's how we evolved. We're connected social creatures. We evolved and lived in social groups. We need each other, we depend on one another, and we live in a world where there's less and less of that. So I think anything that feels connected feels like home. And it's a good feeling. And there's also this other quality that can happen with compassion, and there hasn't been a lot of research on it, and I would call it poignancy. It's almost a little bit like the bittersweet. It's the fullness of compassion. Compassion's very rich and round. And one phrase that some of my compassion teaching colleagues, and when I say compassion teaching, I'll talk more about some of those different approaches to teaching compassion momentarily. But we talk about how compassion requires you to hold opposites. So when you're compassionate, you're holding opposites. So you're holding both the suffering and the pain, because you're really being present with it. Remember, compassion witnesses, you don't flee, So you're holding that on the one hand, and then the possibility, this is where the loving kindness part does come in, the possibility not only of being free of the suffering, but growing and flourishing and all that, the full range, so you're holding all of that. And that's one of the reasons why if you really are being present in all that, you feel bigger and it feels rich. And I like to call compassion, I think compassion's purple, because it's got the red, you got the sadness is blue, the red rosy lenses of love. So compassion's very purple. And I think because of that, I'm going to say very honestly from an experiential perspective, that sometimes when I'm going through a hard time and I've been stressed a lot, I can feel myself slipping from that kind of balanced view of poignancy into like, oh wow, I just can't handle it's so big all the time. It's too much. And I've felt myself slip at times because if you reside in that bigness all the time, you can get pulled to one side or the other. And some self-awareness is important. Okay, so that's kind of that's the whole definitional stuff. I wanted to say a few things about how compassion helps with everything. That's sort of my next phase of the talk. And I already spent a lot of time on how the Brahma Viharas are antidotes, and so any of these four measurable, from a Buddhist perspective, you can be very specific about what compassion can help with, and discussion of compassion goes far beyond just discussion of the Brahma Viharas, but we can say that it is an antidote to cruelty, is an antidote to indifference. I think the indifference thing is really important because cruelty is the prototypical thing that we talk about. You can't sustain compassion and cruelty at the same time. So if you're feeling fully compassionate, you can't be harmful to yourself or others. You might stray and then have to remedy, and that's part of life. So I'm not saying you have to be perfect. I'm not saying anything about how you have to be. But anyway, it's an antidote to cruelty, but the antidote to indifference is really important because if you think about destructive behavior that happens in the world, and between whether it's in a relationship or on a global, socio-political, geopolitical, environmental scale, a lot of it comes from not caring about, I'm okay, who cares if they're not, I'll survive, or I'm okay for right now, I'm going to live another, if I'm lucky, 25, 30 years, and then global warming doesn't affect me, I'll be okay. That's like a really egocentric, non-caring perspective. If you are living in the lap of compassion, if you are remembering all of us, how everything's connected, how we touch one another in all our actions, despite all our differences, then it's really tough to not care. And this is one of the reasons why I think if we could just, release in a big drop over the whole planet, a lot of compassion droplets, to go into everybody, I really think it can save the world if there was some way to have more of it all the time. So anyway, it can help counteract indifference. It can help you care more. Just a couple more Buddhist things before I talk about some of the science that supports what I'm saying, and after I get a drink of water. Okay. I have to share one of my favorite, for no other reason except for this is where I'm going to put it. I could spend a lot of time talking about how compassion just makes you stronger and more courageous. And this is something, most of the research that you're going to hear about are the various benefits of practicing compassion or being compassionate. But research hasn't gone to the point of looking at bravery or courage or strength. I think that's an interesting area for those of you who have any interest in studying this, that we need more work, because I think experientially it's totally true. And in Buddhism, you see like we talk about warrior, being like a compassion warrior. Why do we use that metaphor of being a compassion warrior? Warriors are brave and strong, right? And if you've been working in your meditations, and then translating from your meditations into the lived world, being present with suffering, feeling it how it hits you, and not running, you're getting stronger. It's sort of like, the athletic metaphor, no pain, no gain. And one of the challenge is actually when you're teaching compassion meditation to people and you're going through some of these, visualizations where you're imagining a loved one suffering and seeing how it feels, and people like, oh, I've had students say things, oh, I liked it better when we were just doing the loving kindness stuff. That part, can I just do the loving kindness stuff? I said, you can, but you'll hit a wall in growth, because of the need. Life isn't just all the good stuff, as we know. That famous bumper sticker, blank happens, right? I can't swear in a Dharma talk. I've done it, but I'm not gonna do it today. Okay, so that stuff happens. Bad stuff happens all the time. So you gotta be able to be present with that. And when you practice being present with that, you learn how to endure difficulty better. This is another thing. It's like the resilience. We have a lot of stuff on well-being and less depression and et cetera from practicing compassion. But this sort of like grit and resilience. There are some data on self-compassion. I'll just mention it now, even though I wasn't going to say it yet. But an interesting study that was done years ago out of a group at Emory University, where they had they have a long-term program in trying to develop accessible compassion training programs, but this is one that was done on self-compassion. People were trained in a very brief, like a couple week intervention where they learned self-compassion meditation, or they learned, it was some other kind of control situation where they had like an educational control where they learned information about stuff that could be beneficial for your health. And then people were tested. This is where you test your moxie, or actually test your resilience, to see, they were wanting to see how people dealt with a stressful situation and their recovery from a stressful situation if they'd had the self-compassion training versus this other training. I think they actually had two control groups. And this was a study by Pace and colleagues, or was it this was Arch 2014. one of my favorite studies. Anyway, in this study, they put people, I just have to tell you about the stressors, just so you get a sense of some research that was very ecologically valid, we might call it. There were the people in the study were part of what was called the Trier social stress test. That was, this has been used in a lot of behavioral medicine and psychological research. And what it does is it puts the participants or subjects, depending on how you talk about it, in the research study in some very stressful situations. One's a public speaking task in front of a panel of people who are supposed to look like experts, non-expressive folks in white lab coats behind a conference table. So there's a speech and you have to talk about yourself. Everybody loves to do that. So that was the public speaking. And there's also mental arithmetic aloud. So they have to subtract from a certain number by 13s or some really weird prime number. So they're stressful tasks. And we know they're stressful because people get stressed when they're doing it. They get physiological responses, psychophysiological responses like the autonomic nervous system, heart rate, sweating. And also in this study, they had some hormonal measures of stress response. And they looked at people's stress responses during and after these stressors. And the people who'd gone through the self-compassion training had actually less of a stress response. Physiologically speaking, it was mostly in terms of these physiological indicators during the social stress test. And what was nice is quicker physiological recovery. So this is actually, so if we look at resilience as how you recover from stress, right? How do you bounce back? That's what resilience, that metaphor we use for the psychological quality of resilience is about bouncing back, right? Compassion helps, self-compassion helps. And we can think about how it might, right? Because it's like, oh, I'm learning how to self-soothe, how to bring your arousal down. And what I think is really interesting is they got a little less agitated in the first place. So that shows an ability to kind of regulate the emotion in real time when it's happening. That's just one of my favorite little studies about how compassion can be beneficial. There's also one of the areas in which I worked in research is in the study of intensive meditation training and the effects of when people have gone on like 3-month residential retreat. And I was very fortunate to be part of a project called the Shamatha Project that was conducted out of UC Davis, where we studied the cognitive, neurophysiological, emotional effects of 3 months of intensive meditation training, which included working with the Brahma Viharas on a daily basis. And we had controls and people who were going through the training. We actually had a waitlisted control group. But one of the things we did, and this is where, without getting into the study too much in the interest of time, I said I study emotion. And so my branch of the studies were looking at people's emotional responses to suffering. And in this case, it was scenes of suffering where they are witnessing real life documentary footage from the Iraq War, and hearing both from people who had gone through the bombings as well as people who were doing the bombings, which is very interesting. And our research team actually had the opportunity to present some of this to the Dalai Lama. And His Holiness said, well, you know who needs the compassion the most is the soldiers doing the bombings. And of course, from his perspective, he sees that. And if you've been doing a lot of work with compassion, you see that. But most lay people get really angered and when they see the soldiers who are getting all amped up to bomb. And one of the things that we found by looking at the emotional behavior of people while they witness these films, and I study facial expression, and that's what we were measuring to see their emotional responses to scenes of suffering, is that the people who'd done the training were much more likely, first of all, to be saddened by the suffering of all of them, which is interesting. It's not like they didn't feel negative. Well, I don't like the word negative emotion. Psychology uses that. It's that they didn't feel the discomfort. They were saddened, but what they didn't do was show things like contempt and anger and disgust towards the soldiers. But they were more moved to sadness, which I think is really interesting, that they were showing what His Holiness said would be nice if that's where we want to see some of that compassion arising, because it's easier to feel compassion for the innocent victims than it is for the people who are doing the harm. Anyway, that was a study that was published in 2015. There's so many interesting studies on the benefits of compassion, and there's a lot of research that's been done on what we might call secular, I don't like that word, but the very general, publicly accessible compassion training programs that use meditation from Tibetan Buddhism, along with psychology and medicine and other kinds of sources of knowledge to help people learn how to grow their compassionate nature. And that is, I've been involved in some of those projects, the Compassion Cultivation Training Program, which we developed at Stanford, Thubten Jinpa, the Dalai Lama's primary translator and a former monk and a scholar, was the lead author on that. But there are other programs like that throughout the country that are trying to make it a little bit more accessible to people, because everybody needs to be compassionate. Just like we have mindfulness programs that are like outside of meditation centers. That's sort of the idea there, to make it more accessible. And there's been a lot of research on these programs. And one of the, there's, just to give you a global overview of some of the consistent findings, and I'm just going to say reductions in anxiety, like people having an anxious disposition, improvements in mindful awareness, improvements in performance on being focused and less wandering mind on tasks, so less mind wandering, increases in like questionnaire measures of self-compassion, compassion for others, and pro-social changes in empathy. We also see in some of these studies increases in helping behavior when people are given an opportunity to help. One of my favorite things is when they create these sort of mock social situations. The people who are in the study think they're waiting to do something, and then in the waiting room of the building they're in, somebody walks in on crutches, and they realize they're late for their appointment, and they're feeling pain, and and there's no chairs left. And one of the things the researchers measure is who offers to give up their chair. And it turns out if people have done the compassion training, they're more likely to. And what's interesting is some of the better research, this 2021 paper I'm thinking about in particular, they have, if you're a scientist here, a control condition for knowing what the appropriate thing to do is. So it's not just a matter of knowing that it's nice to, so they get information about doing, kind things. It's not just knowing that it's nice to give up your seat. It's actually, can you do it? Because they're waiting too, and they've been sitting there for a long time. So there's a number of ways helping's actually been measured. One of them is by that kind of scenario that's created. So I don't want to talk about too much more research, except for to say in a global sense, if I'm going to summarize, that experience doing compassion training and actually working with compassion meditation and trying to grow it in your life, and or just studies where they find out who tends to be a compassionate person. If you just are born with a lot of that good stuff or happen to have a lot of compassionate nature, that helps, less likely to be depressed, or it's good for depression and anxiety. So you're less likely to have that, better overall health, more resilience to stress, and also has benefits in conflict resolution, which shouldn't be surprising, because it gives you an opportunity more to first of all, be big, a little less reactive, and put yourself in somebody else's shoes, which is important for resolving conflict. So in terms of what's left, I want to make sure we have time to have some questions. And I see we have about 10 minutes left. So I want to say a couple more things about how you grow compassion, because that was the last thing, sure, and then we can kind of open it up for questions. So how to grow compassion? Well, I am a big advocate of compassion meditation. I think, compassion meditations are really beneficial, and compassion meditations really require you to work with acknowledging suffering in others and yourself. So that one common form of doing that is actually bringing to mind someone who is suffering, and starting with someone maybe who's easy, meaning someone you love, you have great feelings for, very tender toward, and they're uncomplicated for you, and might know a way in which they're suffering from an illness or a psychological burden, financial stress, whatever it is, and being moved by it, and really inviting in the feeling of how it hits you, and also connecting in you the wish that they be free from it. And cultivating wishing that for them. And there's so many different practices that work with imagery and breath and mantra or even just phrases for that person. It's not a class in that, but I'm just kind of wanted to paraphrase a very general approach to compassion meditation. So in your mind and in your body, you are rehearsing being with suffering. You're practicing it. And what happens, just like anything, if you practice, reciting a number or reciting a song or dance moves or anything you're trying to remember, then the more you recite it, the better you have it. And the more you practice it, the better you're able to do it in real life. So I'm a real advocate for traditional and a-traditional ways to cultivate compassion. But I'd like to leave you with some daily life things anybody can try. First of all, always work on being grounded and stable. The more you are in your body, the easier it is to be responsive to what's in the world and in your heart. So there's that part. Pay attention, be here now, right? So pay attention to what's happening in this moment with you, with others. And that will help you notice suffering when it's around. See, and as breaking out, if you're calm enough and the mind's not all, things darting around, if you can calm a little bit, at least get a little space around your stuff, then you can notice other people better. Sometimes we get so absorbed in our own world, or we're so overwhelmed by it, it's hard to do that. So grounded, stable, pay attention, be here now so that you notice suffering. And treat yourself well. This is important. Notice when you need rest. Notice when you need care. Don't forget about you. Sometimes we immediately go out and reach for others and neglect ourselves. And when we neglect ourselves, that's when we're at risk for that empathic distress, burnout, etc. Treat yourself as you would a friend. And it sounds like we could at least be able to do that, but when you really put it that way, a lot of people realize they don't meet that standard. Pema Chodron has this great way of talking about self-compassion. And what she says is, self-compassion is befriending yourself just as you are right now. Just be friends with that. That doesn't mean you don't aspire to change or improve. Just be friends with that. Because if a good friend came to you, they're not perfect, right? You still love them. Can you do that to you? Try it. Another thing in terms of compassion, and also give yourself little treats of life, like notice beauty. That's one of my favorite things. Notice beauty 3 times a day. Remind yourself of what's out there. That's an expansive view that can help with well-being and everything. Other ways to bring compassion into your life. Reach out and connect. Maybe there's somebody who, like a neighbor or someone who lives in your apartment building, maybe, or a colleague that you've recognized but you've never even said hi to, or maybe you've smiled at them and said hi but you don't know their name. Go there, just like reach a little further, and it might be a little uncomfortable at first, but remember what I said, no pain, no gain. You're not going to expand if you don't reach and stretch just a little, and then when you do and it works, guess what happens? There's that warm glow, there's that feeling of being expansive. You can do that. Simple gestures of kindness, any little open a door, carry a bag, listen to somebody's problems. There's so many ways you can do this. So I want to leave you with that, a charge to kind of notice suffering, be present, be kind, be good to yourself, and it'll make everything a lot better. So that's my official end of what I'm going to say. And I do have some time. Yay. So I have some time for questions. Both from the crowd and online. Either way, yeah. Does anybody have a question? Yes, Chris.
Yeah, in that book, Joy on Demand by Chade Meng Tan, who talks about the near and far enemies, there's a section where he talks about someone who'd done, I think, 40,000 hours of compassion meditation, and he could be with someone who was really sad and not go into despair. When I read that section, I said, but I don't have that kind of experience. How does a normal person avoid despair? That's my question.
Right. So did you hear the question in the room? Did you? Okay, good. It's a really good question. It's sort of like you gave the example of somebody who's like a really experienced practitioner and he could be present without going into despair versus you can't. And so I guess I'd like to unpack the despair part, really. And I think, and whether there is there is this phenomenon, having talked to a lot of people who might be called adepts, who've done tens of thousands of hours of meditation and that kind of work, that they can go right into the compassionate response without having kind of that empathic, emotional phase of it. However, a lot of us go through that feeling state, and I'd say that's okay. There's a question, but there's a difference between feeling sadness and feeling unbearable despair. And that's that whole near enemy thing, right? It's okay to feel sad. That means you care. And actually the sad can just be there. And this is where, if you've done the preparatory stuff of worked with stabilizing mind, worked with self-care, you can notice before you get overwhelmed. You know, you can be, okay, I'm sad, and sad is a feeling. And it means that there's been, I'm feeling moved by what they're going through, and they've had a loss or a difficulty, and it's really hard. And I know I don't like to feel that way. And then can you have enough space around that to then also then be there with the sadness and still then go into feel compassion, because sadness is part of the compassion, and if you think about this holding opposites, you also have this wish for them to be free of it, and you don't want to feel that way forever either. But experiencing the sadness makes it real. And it also makes it something that you realize that they would like to be free of at some point, the pain that's causing it. But you don't need to flee from the sadness. You have to be mindful if it becomes overwhelming. And that's where, again, the self-awareness, which comes back in time. The self-awareness is important for what situations do you put yourself in? Are you constantly putting yourself in situations that you can't handle? So we're not always perfect with that. Is like, to titrate it. Titrate your exposure to suffering. Don't avoid it altogether, but don't dive in without taking care, because it's not going to benefit them either. Thank you. Good question. And it's a very practical one, right? And for how we deal with things. Any other questions? Was that a question, Mary, or we just said, yeah, okay. I didn't know if you were like, just speak up. Yeah, go on.
Was that me? You can hear me?
I saw Mary King. I said Mary to Mary King. Did you have a question, Mary King? And we can.
No, I was trying to tell Mary Jo that we couldn't hear her. So
okay, good. It's very good question. Okay, thanks, Mary.
When you replied to Chris, you introduced the word titrate, and I guess something that I've always held is being influenced by that you move into what you can sustain and hold. And then somehow or other, maybe it's self-compassion, but some of that energy comes back in to support yourself the motivation to try to hold whatever space you can manage without judging the quantum of it. And I think another thing I've been thinking about or trying to practice is the difference between being constricted and expanding as a state, both internal and manifested behaviorally in the musculature. So accessing it through your physical body is a good way for me to begin that process of being less constricted. And somehow that's a predeterminer of possibilities, one of which may be compassion. What do you think?
Oh, I think, did you hear Mary Jo, what she said? That, I really love that. I think that's part, I really appreciate you reminding us to be grounded and present in the physical body when we're talking about all this, because we're not just heads walking around. And that's why I talk about the feeling. I mean, to notice the feeling that you're having and how you're moved by it. It's very much an embodiment of, notice where things are hitting you. But part of that whole picture is, how do you arrive on the scene? Are you constricted? Are you expansive? And this is where that self-knowledge is really important. And it's related to the source of dukkha, the source of suffering coming from how you relate to what's going on around you. And when we're constricted, we are more likely to see things as threats, because we're like this, right? We're in our shell. And that's a very protective, defensive mode. And we can feel that when we're tight, right? And that there's a tendency, and we know this from research on the psychophysiology of emotion, that things like anger and fear, those emotions tend to do this to us. They tighten our attentional focus to a way that serves the emotion, that we see through those red colored lenses or whatever when we're angry, that we do. That's what we do. And we put blinders on, and things serve the story of the anger. And also physiologically, we're tighter, we're aroused, we're agitated, muscle tension. A lot of it's like right here. If we can be more expansive, and there is more of a quiesce, when we talk about what positive emotional states do, psychophysiologically, they can help us recover from that agitation. And there is a broadening. Barbara Fredrickson who has really pioneered this research by showing not only about how positive emotions, I hate that positive negative thing, but what we generally regard as positive emotions, happiness, joy, amusement, and love, they tend to broaden our focus. We get bigger in how we think. Also physiologically, there's more of an expansiveness, a readiness, and openness. And apropos this embodied point, I think one of my favorite phrases that I didn't share with you comes from Roshi Joan Halifax, who's a Zen teacher and founder of Upaya Zen Center. And she uses this metaphor, which I think is really great, to describe the embodiment of compassion. And she said, when we're compassionate, we have strong back, soft front. And I love that, because so what we're, Mary Jo, we get at that openness, right? At that expansiveness. And the softness of the front is, I am willing, Chris, to feel the sadness. I've been working with suffering. I can handle it. And I know it's a powerful feeling. And that one of my favorite lines ever from Tartang Tulku Rinpoche is that we should not avoid our emotions. We can have no more profound teachers about our relationship with the world. They tell us what we think of what's going on. That's a paraphrasing, but this is like from page 51 of Openness Mind. But it's true. It's like they are teachers, oh, I'm sad because I care. Your emotions tell you how you feel. So we can be strong, we can be receptive, we can be open, we can handle it. And that's the permeability of the soft front, but the strong back is the strength that comes from all this training, of being present with suffering. And that makes us very responsive and reliable. So maybe we'll stop there unless anybody's got a real pressing question, but thank you all. Thank you for being here. Thank you to Nyingma Institute for letting me be, I think, Harrian was saying, a pioneer in bringing back the in-person Dharma talks here. And thank you for putting up with the integration of technology. It was great to talk about my favorite topic with you all. May there be great benefit of this time that we spent together. May all beings be free from suffering and its causes, and may they all have happiness, joy, love, peace, and its causes. Take care, everybody. Bye. 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 Bye-bye. Thank you.